We have one that's deceased. We've had 3 transported to the hospital.
For those most affected by a homicide,
She asked me, when's her daddy gonna wake up and come home?
the first 48 is just the beginning.
You just hear gunshots. I could hear a woman. Okay. Oh my God, help me. She said it was my ex-boyfriend.
It's all testosterone, running wild.
He had shot and killed people that he didn't know. You can't be a vigilante and you can't just go on a killing spree. It's what nightmares are made of.
This is the story of the fight for justice.
A jury of 12 people can say, you deserve an opportunity to be out one day.
Everything went off the rails.
In the weeks, months, and years.
911, did you police fire medical?
I need medical.
What's going on?
I don't know, I just woke up. I heard this talk like this. And I go on my balcony and I hit 2 people.
We've got officers on the way.
First responders find 4 people shot. 2 men and a woman are wounded. 1 man is dead on the scene.
I grew up in Tulsa. Got to know a lot of what goes on the streets. I always want to do the best job for the city. I just wanted it to be a safe place to live. It's a chaotic world. Well, once you get to a scene like that, you have to keep cool.
But right now, tensions is real high because we have 4 people shot.
You just gotta stay level-headed. You can't get too high and you can't get too low on this job, or it'll eat you alive.
What is going on?
We have one that's deceased here on the sidewalk in between the apartments.
Got a positive ID on him. His name is Joshua Smith.
26-year-old Joshua Smith enrolled in culinary school and had plans to open a restaurant. He is survived by a large family, including his 1-year-old daughter.
I can see multiple gunshot wounds.
Joshua was shot 8 times.
We've had 3 transported to the hospital for gunshot wounds.
One shot in the head doesn't look good.
Okay.
Marco Celestine Jr. is 23 years old. He enjoys fishing, rafting, and dancing. He and his girlfriend Raven have a daughter and another baby on the way.
But we have to just follow the evidence, follow the leads, and then let that take you to where you need to be.
And we got several casings here in the parking lot, in the sidewalk.
They recover 11, all .40 caliber.
Looks initially like it started out here in the parking lot. Shots were fired.
The scene was basically the entire apartment complex. There was people shot in different parts of the complex.
It continued down here to the east. Also the hallway to the north, another victim. That's where she went down. She got shot in the body. So we can talk to her. Yeah.
A 19-year-old woman is in stable condition at the hospital.
And there was another witness that was actually pursued from that area of the initial shooting and was shot at a laundromat not far from the scene. He had been transported out in stable condition.
The bullet is still lodged in his body. He's 27 years old.
These victims, they had to be terrified.
One of the more horrific cases I've had. It's what nightmares are made of.
So the first thing that I want to do is start assigning the officers different tasks.
Public safety is a concern when you have a mass shooting like this where 4 people have been shot. So we're all doing our best to find the suspect as quick as possible.
While detectives Leatherman and Brown head to interview surviving victims at the hospital. The team canvasses the apartment complex.
me talk to you real quick, ma'am.
Detective Warren, I'm on TPD homicide. We need the community. Trust is very, very important.
I just got shot.
I'll need you to come down with us.
Right now, me and Max have done everything that we can do here. We're gonna head downtown and start on the interviews.
2 hours into the investigation,
We bring witnesses back to the detective division because it separates them from the scene. This person may have seen something that was very, very important, but listening to someone else, it can become skewed a little bit. So we want to try to separate all our witnesses so we can get the true story.
I do appreciate you coming down. You're gonna talk to me? Everybody in that situation is a little traumatized. That helps when you bring them down to detective division. It gives them a little time to calm down before you start the interview.
I'm sitting on my couch with my cat, watching TV, and then out of nowhere, you just hear gunshots. Consecutive, boom, boom, like just going off.
Okay.
I just hit the ground. When the gun stopped, I could hear a woman.
Okay.
I said, oh my God, help me. I swung my door open. That's what happened. Then everybody started coming out. You know, people started running. Oh my God. Oh my God. She said, it was my ex-boyfriend.
So I gave us a lead, the girl's ex-boyfriend.
across town,
Can you hear me? Hey, I'm with the police department.
Leatherman talks to the 19-year-old victim as she prepares for surgery.
And we were hoping the victim could positively identify the suspect and give us a motive as to why he did what he did.
Who shot you?
Caleb Young.
Tell me what happened.
I went over there to visit my friend Josh. We walked up to the laundromat, and one of Caleb's friends was there. I saw him on the phone when we walked away from there. He was looking over at me. I had a feeling that it was Caleb that he was on the phone with. About 30 minutes later, Caleb popped up.
Why did he do this?
Because we broke up. He threatened to kill me before.
She believes Caleb was jealous of one of the victims who was her new boyfriend. So what did these other individuals do to you? Is it just that you were so angry that you took out everybody that was with the person that you were really trying to get?
Caleb Young.
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay.
Feels great whenever you get the suspect identified quickly.
20-year-old Caleb Young recently graduated from Tulsa Tech. He has no prior convictions.
It was very odd and it stuck out. Why would someone that had no criminal history end up in the middle of the day, go out on a shooting rampage?
Then,
Ronnie did hear that Marco was brain dead. Unfortunately, Joshua and Marco got the worst of it.
As an advocate, you're trying to make sure each victim is treated individually when you have 4 victims in one case. Joshua Smith's family was obviously, very upset. Between Tulsa Police and our office, we're reaching out to them to get them resources for funeral expenses and updating them. The girlfriend, she's recovering from her injuries. We want to make sure she gets access to resources, but we also want to make sure she's at a place where she's stable enough to have more conversations with us.
We have another one that actually survived that is blind, totally blind.
We have another victim that's not expected to survive, Marco. Each victim, whether deceased or living, their family is dealing with all of the emotions attached with that, the shock of the crime itself.
We have a really good suspect in mind, then it's not asking to get him arrested for the safety of the citizens.
And we notify our fugitive warrants unit, and then we start looking for this person.
After you get a suspect's address, it's all hands on deck.
3 hours in, Detective Chase Calhoun heads to meet officers at Caleb's address.
They're sitting on the house. We have a white Nissan Altima.
that land spot can get into.
Fugitive warrants officers spot Caleb leaving his home.
I'll be up there in a minute.
Just be advised, you got 2 officers in the front of the car.
We had a suspect that was extremely dangerous that was willing to go in broad daylight and shoot someone he knew and total strangers.
We don't know the mindset of the suspect. We don't know what he's out to do. Get that person in custody as quick as we possibly can.
I was 10 weeks pregnant. This is Marco the third. He's 7 months. My daughter talks about him all the time. She asked me, when's her daddy gonna wake up and come home? I just miss his presence. He was awesome.
Outside Caleb's house.
The suspect gets in a white car and they take off.
That car was subsequently stopped by fugitive warrants, and Caleb was taken into custody without incident. We also picked up the family member, and we were able to transport them downtown.
The house is secured.
We're feeling relief that everybody's safe.
Then,
Are you Dad? I'm Chase Calhoun.
How you doing? Chase was actually able to be Caleb's father, Derek, and explain to him the circumstances on why we needed to talk to his son.
I had just left home and I hadn't been gone that long. I was like, this is crazy.
There's been a shooting out east.
So did somebody get hurt?
And somebody's dead.
I was just like, what? I still couldn't believe it.
So would you be willing to go downtown with us?
I definitely, yeah.
Three hours in, the team will interview Caleb's father and family member first.
Now we're gonna do Caleb last and see what he has to say after confronted with all the evidence. It's very unique when a family member of a suspect will come down and actually cooperate.
I needed him to provide us with more information. Needed to figure out if Caleb was or was not there.
Okay, you have information that you're wanting to pass on?
Probably about a month ago, his girlfriend, she had been staying with us. She didn't have a place to go, so I was like, she can stay a week until she get herself together. They was having an argument.
It was pouring down rain and they were out in the street fussing, fighting. And then next thing I know, he came over and he punched the trailer so hard, I thought he broke his hand.
He says Caleb's girlfriend left the next morning.
That following Monday, she called me. I left some clothes over there. Can I come get them? She came with a guy.
She was expecting me to be gone, and they parked up the street, came and got the rest of her things. Caleb, he didn't even know she was here.
No sooner than they got around the corner, Caleb said, Dad, that guy that was with her just sent me a message telling me I'm gonna get mine.
I mean, it was text saying, we know where your sister's room is.
I said, look, man, you have to be careful of guys like this. The guy just kept going back and forth.
Derek spoke about people threatening Caleb, but I was just trying to figure out what was going on in his life to where he was getting these threats.
I mean, was he doing something else that somebody be after him?
No, not to my knowledge, no.
He says Caleb had something else to look forward to.
So he went out and did all the stuff to join the service. He's supposed to be leaving in June.
Which branch?
Marines. And so we was on that path.
Homicide suspects usually don't have a life plan that includes going to military service and serving in their country. So it did stand out in this case.
So in your mind, it's all behind this girl?
Yeah, because none of this started happening until
he brought her home.
Until he brought her home, they got into an argument, and then he was just like, I'm through with her. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday night, they came and shot the house up.
Hang on, back up for a minute.
I don't know who they is, but I know it's behind that girl.
Were you or your family there?
Yeah, we was all at home asleep. They just like pulled up, like right there, and just started shooting.
Did you ask your son about it?
Yeah, I mean, he was at home.
So these are bullet holes that have been patched up.
And I still replay it like, that's scary.
Prior to the incident, Caleb said, Dad, look, they texting me. They gonna get me. That night, as soon as he came in and sat down and started watching TV, I went in the room. The girls, they were in their rooms. Everybody, we was all here. As soon as I sat down on the edge of my bed,
And all I heard was pew, pew.
I was like, what in the world?
Shots were fired. I could hear the glass like from the car window was breaking. I rolled off of my bed onto the floor.
And all I was hearing was Caleb in the living room was like, sis, you good? Are you okay?
When I walked in here, he was kind of like he couldn't move, like, what in the world's going on? We needed to figure out why that actually happened and if this thing was connected in any kind of way.
There's always two sides of the story, and we want it. We're definitely gonna listen, and maybe it will explain something we don't know about.
So you obviously made a police report?
Yes.
Okay.
We've reported a crime. These people, they were still driving down our street every day. They still texted Caleb every day. He thought, am I supposed to sit at home and wait?
You get your house shot up, and then you go do a shooting. Yeah, I mean, anybody would think there's an obvious connection there, but I just had to find it prior to interviewing the suspect. You want to have as much information as you possibly can. That way you can have a conversation with the suspect.
Warren turns next to Caleb's family member.
And I believe this person is the one that actually made the phone call.
We walked up to the laundromat, and one of Caleb's friends was there. I saw him on the phone. I had a feeling that it was Caleb that he was on the phone with.
So I said, most of the questions that I'm asking you, I already know the answers to. Think before you answer your questions, okay? Were you in the laundromat?
Yeah, I was on the phone.
You on the phone, Caleb? I mean, if you were, you were.
I mean, yeah.
Did you tell Caleb that you saw somebody else in the apartments?
I said I seen your eggs.
Did you tell him that you saw somebody else out there? Anybody else? Did you see her with anybody?
I think her little boyfriend or whatnot.
Did you say what he was getting ready to do?
Nah, he walked off. Just when I heard them gunshots. Yeah, like damn.
Just Detective Ryan, this is my partner.
Hey, Dan. Was he mad about the other guy dating his ex-girlfriend?
No, he was mad about them shooting the house.
The family member seems to think the house had been shot up and it had enraged Caleb so bad that he wanted revenge.
In the car right after it happens, would you say he was nervous or excited or not his normal self?
He was actually he was normal.
Normal after, okay.
It was no, I was upset. It was no being angry. It was almost a sense of I got somebody back. It was unnormal of how a person would react after such a thing. Just sit tight, bro.
I can't really explain why Caleb got out of the car and just started shooting people without even confronting them. Hopefully he'll give a statement at that point.
And I'm Detective Warren. This is my partner, Detective Ryder. I wasn't going in and start pointing fingers at him. We just went in and we just held a conversation. I just wanted to go in and just get the truth from him. I believe a lot of times they just want to get it off the chest. Man, I was talking to your dad. Are you talking about going to the military?
Marines. Well, I wasn't going to take my drug test today until all this happened.
And he said a kind of a key word before all this happened. Now, that opened the door, so we want to know what all this is.
Here's the deal. I got some information that... Did somebody shoot your dad's house up?
Yeah. Because I broke up with my ex-girlfriend.
Okay. I guess she has a new boyfriend.
That's who shot at my house.
Had you ever met him before?
Oh, I ain't met him. About a month and a half ago. They had called my phone and talked about, yeah, I pulled up to your house.
He'd been threatened, but we don't know what the threats were. He wouldn't give me a name. We don't know how true that is.
But today, something triggered you. Your friend called you and said she was at the apartment complex. Did you drive to the apartment complex?
Mm-hmm.
When you arrived at the complex, what is in your mind?
I had to do something before he did something.
When you left home, did you know you were going to shoot them before you even got out of the car?
You come over shooting my house up, that's not gonna go. I'm not gonna let that slap.
I kind of looked at Max, and Max kind of looked at me, and it was just like, wow. He was just as calm and collective as I'm sitting here.
It was shocking to me. Caleb didn't see who shot up his house. He had no evidence who had done it. A month later, he had shot and killed people that he didn't know.
He tried to somehow connect his house being shot up with those individuals that was with her.
Where was everybody standing?
Upstairs.
Did they ever get a chance to even talk to you?
No. I seen both of them right there.
Caleb says he spotted his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend.
So shoot. The police ain't gonna do nothing if they come back and shoot us house. People know me, like, they know if they mess with me, I'm getting mad. I just get to a point where I'm not gonna stop.
He was on a mission, and he was going to complete his mission.
Are you sorry for what happened this afternoon? You're not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sit tight on me, okay?
You can't be a vigilante, and if your house gets shot up a month ago, you can't just go on a killing spree. He did not care that he had done this. It shocked the conscience. For someone that had just shot 4 people, he was very calm.
There has to be something in you to make you kill somebody, take a life from somebody. I was like, man, where's this guy's head at?
I'm Detective Warren, Tulsa Police Homicide.
Warren calls Joshua's mother.
We got the person that did it. They confessed to it. Yes, ma'am. You are welcome. You call me if you need anything, okay? Thank you very much. All right. She's distraught right now. What can you say? You know, but you're sorry.
I let Derek go in and see his son for the last time.
Like daily?
I really, really felt bad for his dad because he had other aspirations for his son.
Dude, let it go, man. Let it go. He was about to leave. Why, baby? Why? You was about to go to the Marines, man. You only had 2 or 3 more weeks.
You could tell it was hitting him, what he had done. And he finally showed that with his dad, that, hey, Dad, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Just like I told him, I didn't want him to come to us. I love you, Dad. You know I love you.
Now you say, man, the guy does actually have feelings. And that was something to see. I'm gonna protect my family. That's the frame of mind Caleb is in.
I just told him, I'm gonna love you no matter what.
All right, baby. Take care of yourself, and we're gonna be looking out for you, okay? All right.
Then,
Marco Celestine ultimately died from his injuries. Not only did those two individuals die, you still had two more people that were shot. Now I have one guy that's permanently blind and another that's gonna have just issues the rest of her life. It's heartbreaking, you know?
Caleb Young is now charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of shooting with intent to kill.
Once Caleb was arrested, we turned it over to the district attorney's office.
It's a simple case from the standpoint of, do we know who shot them? Yes. But does it all make sense? No.
As the prosecution prepares their case,
Anytime you have a confession, you want an eyewitness who can give us an account that's not Caleb's of what happened that day.
We interviewed the ex-girlfriend several days after she leaves the hospital to see if there's anything that she remembered later on down the line.
It was a really important part of the investigation to hear from that ex-girlfriend, simply because it would fill in who Caleb Young is and what drove him to do what he did that day.
Okay, just kind of go back and be as detailed as you possibly can, okay?
I went to see my friend Josh, and then I saw Caleb's friend on the phone over the trash can looking over at me. So I told Josh, I was like, Josh, I'm not feeling too good about this.
It's okay.
Like 30 minutes later, Caleb came around the corner, didn't say a word, looked right at me, and I knew what's gonna happen.
He didn't say anything prior to pulling the trigger. He just walked up to the group and just started firing.
You want there to be a fight, something that aggravates the situation, that could explain it.
He pulled the gun out, he started talking to everybody. He shot me.
But he just came up and started shooting people for no reason.
I wonder if Caleb even knows what Caleb was thinking when he walked up and started firing on those 4 people.
To your knowledge, anybody that got shot, did they have anything to do with his house being shot?
No, they did not. Nobody, like not even I.
The girlfriend denied any involvement, and there's no evidence that she ever did anything like that.
There was no connection to any of these individuals to Caleb's house being shot up.
Caleb Young got absorbed into the breakup. My house got shut up, it's probably her too. And I think he just kind of went from point to point connecting all those events and really didn't have any justification.
Caleb's motive didn't hold water.
Just as the prosecution's case is looking airtight,
The defense asserted the issue of mental competence to the court. In the state of Oklahoma, competency is, do they understand the nature and consequence of the offense? Do they have the kind of mental acuity to allow them to participate and assist in their own defense? Those are kind of the fundamental questions that the court has to examine. The defense asserted that he wasn't competent to stand trial. Competency is whether or not you're capable of assisting in your own defense in the courtroom, understanding the process, what's going on, understanding the nature of your charges.
Caleb's attorney files a motion claiming her client is not competent to stand trial.
She articulated to the court that in his head, he would get probation. He had told his attorney he could probably still go to the Marines, and that he was totally justified in what he did. She knew all 3 of those things are not an accurate interpretation of his status. The task is to have Caleb forensically evaluated by a competent and qualified examiner, and then that report is sent back to the court.
I performed a comprehensive evaluation in the Caleb Young case. Young adults really don't have logical, rational decisions to 24. The frontal lobes are not working, especially with males. It's all testosterone, running wild. And when they get into a precarious position, they react. This individual had some mitigating circumstances. They were shooting up his house. He had gotten to the point where he broke. He snapped.
Caleb Young made a plan, followed through on the plan, and then worked to get away.
When we're talking about whether someone can be held accountable for what they've done, the question is, do you know in that moment whether what you're doing is right or whether what you're doing is wrong?
It was very clear that he was an intelligent young man when he approached the group and started firing, that he knew what he was doing.
At the end of the day, Caleb's interview, when he point blank, in a cold, cold way, stated that once you get me going, there's no stopping me, that was due to a very intentional decision on his part to go to that apartment complex that day and open fire.
Caleb Young absolutely understood the ramifications of his actions. That's competency. So ultimately, the court found Caleb Young to be competent to stand trial. After the competency process, we were on a trial track and we were ready to go.
But as the court date approaches,
Caleb's attorney came to us with a request for a plea agreement, and part of that discussion was obviously Caleb's age. He was a really young guy at the time of these crimes.
If it would save the victims' families going through the trial, if it would save a group of citizens from having to see the pictures, then it seemed like that was a fair resolution. And so I offered what I thought was fair.
The offer was life imprisonment with the possibility of parole.
Caleb was sitting in the county jail, and he was just like, man, if I'm about to do time, let me get it started. He had called me. He said he had signed for the plea deal.
That is a big deal for someone to go ahead and plead guilty without a jury trial.
Victim advocates will let the victims' families know, hey, we've offered life, and he's accepted.
the hearing is held in front of the judge, with Caleb and the victims' families present.
There's usually an elocution that's written out. The judge usually will read that. This day, this time, I did this. It caused these kinds of injuries. You understand that means life in the penitentiary? Yes. Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty and for no other reason? Yes.
And then the atmosphere changed when we hear Raven Smith's victim impact statement.
One of the victims was Marco Celestine. Marco had a longtime girlfriend, and Raven stood up to offer some victim impact evidence.
She did not get very far into the statement before it was clear she was upset with the plea deal.
Right out of the gate was, I don't agree with this. This doesn't take into account the reality that 2 people are dead. This isn't justice, and it's not enough.
Raven did not like what the plea was going to be. She said to the judge, "How can you do this and let this person out?" I can imagine it's a very powerful moment that you're up there and Raven had lost someone she cared about, and she just spoke.
Everyone in the courtroom, including us, the defense attorney, and the judge, were caught off guard.
The judge cut her off. She did not finish her victim impact statement, and the judge called us into chambers. We were not expecting that at all.
The judge brought the plea hearing to a halt. Everything went off the rails.
The families wanted a trial. They believed that this defendant would get more time with the jury.
After we talked in chambers, counsel came back out into the open courtroom, and judge quickly let us know that she was not accepting that plea.
The judge was uncomfortable with the family being upset, and so she stopped it and said, "Well, we'll just set it for trial."
While the victim's family was happy at that point in time, that Caleb was no longer going to be sentenced to life with parole. That could have very well been what the jury's going to do next at a jury trial.
When Caleb had gotten the deal, and then they took it back from him, he was kind of upset. How could you offer a man or a woman something and then take it back?
We were just dumbfounded. And Mr. Young's attorney was really frustrated.
She filed the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. It is asking them to enforce the plea agreement that was offered previously.
One of the arguments that the defense made in their motion was that by sending Mr. Young to trial, that it was exposing him to double jeopardy.
Caleb's attorney was saying he pled guilty, and now you're taking him to a jury trial, which is being prosecuted. It's like him being prosecuted twice for the same thing. And double jeopardy stands as a constitutional right where you cannot be tried for the same offense twice.
The judge ultimately ruled against the defense. There wasn't a legal basis for the double jeopardy. It restores him back to a presumption of innocence, and let's go to trial.
Caleb Young must now face a jury and the families of his alleged victims.
We still needed to meet our burden of proof.
We had surveillance video and his statements and statements from witnesses and statements that they received from the girlfriend.
And the jury got to see still photos, and then they got to hear from Detective Warren.
I think we've presented several videos during court.
One was found after Caleb's arrest.
We had video of the shooting, and we had the shooter running away. It really gave us a solid picture of what took place and allowed us to compare that to the eyewitness accounts.
The surveillance video was grainy. And the shooter on the surveillance video is right-handed. The defense crossing Detective Warren and asking, would it surprise you if Caleb Young was actually left-handed?
The defense said in trial that wasn't Caleb in the video. That was a last-ditch effort to save his life and to raise doubt. And then the jury heard his confession.
When you left home, did you know you were going to shoot him before you even got out of the car?
And then we point blank asked him, were you sorry or for what you did? And he said no. I think he pretty much sealed his own doom right then.
The jury responded like all of us, of a mixture of shock, surprise, and confusion. Surely somebody wouldn't just say, yeah, I shot him.
He presented in his interview so cold, and he was not sorry for what he did.
At the end of the day, the hard reality for the defense was her guy said he did it, and that's the thing she was fighting. You shoot 4 people, kill 2 of them, blind 1 of them, and injure the other. What's fair?
After 3 days of trial,
the jury came back and determined Caleb was guilty of all 4 counts. 2 counts of murder in the first degree and 2 counts of shooting with intent to kill.
They recommended life sentences on everything, and it was a life with possibility of parole.
A jury of 12 people can say, you deserve an opportunity to be out one day.
but ultimately, how Caleb will serve those sentences is up to the judge.
The judge takes that and can run them concurrently, meaning running together.
Or would the judge run any of them consecutively and stack them such that it would be one life sentence after another and keep him practically in the penitentiary for the rest of his life with no real possibility of parole?
When we came back for sentencing, judge ran them against each other. Counts 1, 2, and 3 consecutive and count 4 concurrent.
One life sentence after another. The impact is Mr. Young will, in all likelihood, die in a penitentiary.
The victims' families were present during the sentencing, and they were very happy.
I don't think there is a maximum justice for families who lose someone to homicide. The loss is always there. The best we can do is just give people some sort of finality with the surviving victims. There's some guilt as to why did I live and they didn't. If you're living day to day with a permanent reminder of what happened that day, I can't imagine that it's easy to move forward. People who survive something like this, you know, hopefully they realize how strong they are.
I do give that condolences to their family, and still do. We all know that he had to go to prison and do whatever time. It's definitely life-changing. I would come in here sometime, and when he would not be here, I would just break down.
One year after the shooting that injured two and took the lives of Joshua and Marco.
Who is that?
My dad.
Marco was funny. He was nice. I mean, he loved his kids. 1, 2, 3.
We love you, partner. It's fine. I love you, Daddy.
The evidence had been sitting in a police evidence room for almost 40 years. Nobody knew it would become the piece that finally changed everything. In 1984, Salem was quieter than it is today. The streets were darker at night. Fewer cameras watched the roads. There were no cell phones tracking movements, no digital records documenting every transaction, no databases capable of instantly connecting one forgotten name to another. If someone disappeared, investigators depended on people remembering what they had seen. If someone lied, detectives depended on finding the lie. And if evidence was overlooked, it could remain forgotten for decades. On a cold November evening in 1984, 27-year-old Laura Bennett left her apartment in southeast Salem. She told a neighbor she would be gone for less than an hour. She never came back. At first, nobody thought it was a murder. Laura was young. She was independent. She worked at a local medical office and had a small circle of friends. She had no known history of disappearing. No one expected danger. Her neighbor remembered seeing Laura walk toward her car shortly after 8 o'clock. The parking lot was nearly empty. A light rain had begun falling. Laura carried a small purse and a paper bag. She unlocked her car. She got inside. Then she drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The next morning, Laura's supervisor called her apartment. No answer. Another call followed. Still nothing. By noon, her absence had become impossible to explain. Laura had not arrived at work. She had not called. She had not contacted her family. Her car was missing. Police were notified. At first, officers treated it as a missing person investigation. They checked hospitals. They checked local roads. They contacted friends. They searched places Laura was known to visit. Nothing. Then, shortly after midnight, a patrol officer noticed something unusual on a quiet road outside Salem. A vehicle was parked on the shoulder. The headlights were off. The driver's door was closed. The car appeared abandoned. The license plate belonged to Laura Bennett. Inside, officers found her purse. Her identification was still there. So were her keys. But Laura was gone. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No broken window. No overturned seats. No blood visible inside the vehicle. That detail immediately complicated the investigation. If Laura had been abducted from the car, why was there no obvious evidence? If she had left voluntarily, where had she gone? And why would she leave her purse behind? The questions began multiplying. Investigators searched the area around the vehicle. They found footprints in wet soil. Most were too damaged by rain to identify. A second set appeared farther from the road. That discovery changed the tone of the search. Detectives began treating the vehicle not simply as an abandoned car, but as a possible crime scene. Officers photographed everything. They collected fibers. They collected fragments. They searched beneath the seats. They examined the trunk. They checked the doors. They looked for fingerprints. At the time, forensic technology was nothing like what investigators have today. A tiny trace of biological material might be collected without anyone knowing whether it would ever become useful. A fingerprint might be too incomplete to identify. A fiber might simply be labeled and placed into an evidence envelope. Investigators could not predict which piece would matter. They had to collect what they could. And they did. By sunrise, Laura's disappearance had become a major investigation. Search teams moved through the surrounding area. Officers checked drainage ditches. Volunteers walked through wooded sections. Dogs were brought in. The weather made everything harder. Rain softened the ground. Wind scattered leaves. Footprints disappeared. Small pieces of evidence became almost impossible to distinguish from debris. But the search continued. For 2 days. Then 3. Then 4. On the 5th morning, a hunter discovered something along an isolated stretch of land outside the city. At first, he thought it was clothing. Then he saw the body. Police arrived within minutes. The scene was secured. The victim was eventually identified as Laura Bennett. She had been dead for several days. The missing person investigation became a homicide investigation. And Salem suddenly had a murder. The medical examiner determined that Laura had suffered fatal injuries consistent with homicide. Investigators began reconstructing her final hour. She had left her apartment. She had driven away. At some point, she had encountered someone. Her car had been abandoned. And somehow, Laura had ended up miles away. The killer had vanished. There was no obvious eyewitness. No confession. No weapon. No clear motive. Only fragments. A vehicle. A purse. A few damaged footprints. A handful of fibers. And a woman who would never return home. Detectives started with Laura's personal life. They interviewed coworkers, friends, neighbors, former acquaintances, anyone who had spoken to her during the days before her death. They wanted to know whether Laura had been frightened, whether she had received threats, whether someone had been following her, whether she had mentioned a stranger. One coworker remembered Laura saying that someone had called her apartment several times, but Laura had not seemed particularly worried. Another friend said Laura had recently argued with someone. The identity of that person became an early lead. Detectives questioned him. He denied threatening Laura. He denied seeing her that night. He provided an explanation for his whereabouts. At the time, investigators could not disprove it. The lead weakened. Then another name appeared. A man who had occasionally done repair work near Laura's apartment building. He knew the residents. He knew the parking lot. He knew when people came and went. That alone meant nothing. But investigators discovered that he had spoken with Laura shortly before her disappearance. He admitted the conversation. He said it was brief. He said he had not seen her afterward. Again, there was no evidence strong enough to hold him. The investigation widened. Detectives followed dozens of leads. Some ended immediately. Others lasted weeks. Every possible suspect had to be considered. But without a witness, the case remained difficult. The investigators needed something physical, something that could survive questioning, something that could connect a person to Laura. They returned to the car. The vehicle was processed again. Every item was cataloged. The steering wheel, the door handles, the seats, the floor, the trunk, the paper bag, the fibers. The officers noticed something near the passenger side floor, a small dark fiber. It did not match Laura's clothing. It was collected, placed into an evidence envelope, cataloged, then stored. At the time, nobody knew what it was. It could have come from a coat, a blanket, a car seat, a carpet, almost anything. The detective wrote the item into the report, then moved on. There were hundreds of other pieces of information competing for attention. The case continued. Weeks passed, then months. The suspect interviews produced nothing. The laboratory reports produced no decisive identification. The footprints were inconclusive. The fiber could not be linked to a specific person. The weapon was never recovered. And the investigation began losing momentum. That is how a murder becomes a cold case. Not with one dramatic moment. There is no bell, no announcement. One day, detectives simply have fewer places to look. The active leads disappear. The phone stops ringing. The newspapers move on. The family continues waiting. The case remains open. But the investigation becomes quiet. For Laura's family, there was nothing quiet about it. Her mother kept her bedroom almost unchanged. Her younger brother refused to believe that the investigation was finished. He called detectives periodically. He asked whether anything had happened. Most of the time, the answer was the same. Nothing new. Years passed. The file remained. The evidence remained. The names remained. But the people changed. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved. Buildings were demolished. Roads were reconstructed. The city expanded. And the murder slowly became a story that fewer people remembered. Then came the first major break. It happened almost 40 years after Laura disappeared. A detective assigned to review old homicide files opened Laura's case. There was no expectation of a miracle. The detective simply wanted to determine whether any evidence had never been fully tested. The original reports were scanned. The evidence inventory was reviewed. The old photographs were examined. And then the detective found the reference. Item 84. 117. A small fiber recovered from Laura's vehicle. The description was only a few lines. Dark synthetic material. Recovered from passenger side floor. Preserved. Untested beyond original microscopic comparison. The detective stopped. Untested. After all those years, the evidence had never produced an identification. That did not mean it contained the answer, but it meant nobody could say for certain that it did not. The item was retrieved from storage. The envelope was old. The label was faded. But the chain of custody was intact. Inside was the same tiny fragment investigators had collected in 1984. A piece of evidence so small that it could fit beneath a fingernail. For decades, it had meant nothing. Now modern forensic technology had changed the possibilities. Investigators submitted the material for advanced examination. The laboratory began testing. And for the first time since Laura Bennett disappeared, a piece of evidence from the original crime scene was about to speak. The question was whether it would say anything at all, because after nearly 40 years, investigators had learned one painful truth. The past does not always leave answers behind. Sometimes it leaves only fragments. A photograph, a statement, a footprint washed away by rain, a vehicle abandoned in darkness, a fiber trapped beneath a seat. And sometimes, if that fragment survives long enough, science can finally reveal what investigators could not see the first time. The laboratory report was still pending. The detectives waited. The family waited. And somewhere inside that old evidence envelope was a clue that had been silent since 1984. Nobody yet knew whether it would identify a killer. Nobody knew whether it would eliminate a suspect. Nobody knew whether the case was about to change forever. But after 38 years, the forgotten evidence was finally being examined again. And this time, the investigators were ready to listen. The laboratory report did not arrive with sirens. There was no dramatic phone call in the middle of the night. No detective running through a hallway. No television camera waiting outside the station. The breakthrough began quietly inside a laboratory where a technician examined a piece of evidence that had been collected in 1984. A small dark fiber. Item 84. 117. For decades, it had been almost meaningless. A fragment. A question mark. Something investigators had preserved because they knew better than to throw evidence away, even when they had no way to explain it. Now the technology was different. The laboratory could examine characteristics that investigators in 1984 could never have analyzed with the same precision. The fiber itself could not tell a story. It could not say who touched it. It could not explain why it was inside Laura Bennett's car, but it could provide a comparison. That was enough. The detectives waited for the first result. And while they waited, they returned to the old file. They read everything. Again, the original missing person report, the first search, the discovery of Laura's vehicle, the discovery of her body, the autopsy, the witness interviews, the suspect interviews, the evidence inventory, the photographs, the handwritten notes. Everything. One detail kept appearing. Laura had not appeared frightened when she left her apartment. That suggested she had not expected danger. She knew where she was going. She may have known the person she was meeting. That possibility became important. If the killer had been a complete stranger, why would Laura have entered the situation willingly? If she trusted the person, how had that trust been used against her? Investigators began rebuilding the final evening. It was not easy. The original reports did not provide a perfect timeline. Sometimes were approximate. Some witnesses remembered only portions of the evening. Some accounts had been recorded days after the event. But a pattern emerged. Laura left her apartment shortly after 8. She was seen near her vehicle. She drove away. Later that night, her car was found abandoned. The body was discovered days afterward. The gap between those points was where the murder had occurred. The detectives wanted to fill it. They began checking old telephone records where available. They examined employment records. They reviewed addresses. They looked at people who had interacted with Laura during the final week of her life. One name appeared repeatedly: Daniel Mercer. He was not Laura's boyfriend. He was not a family member. He was not a close friend. He had worked as a contractor in the area and had occasionally performed maintenance work near Laura's apartment complex. In 1984, investigators had interviewed him. He had admitted knowing Laura. He said they had spoken several times, but he denied having any romantic relationship with her. He denied meeting her the night she disappeared. His statement had been considered. Then the case moved on. Now detectives looked at Mercer differently. The original report contained something they had not noticed before. Mercer had told investigators he had been working late that evening. He had given the name of a coworker who supposedly saw him. But when detectives checked the old statement, the coworker had never been formally interviewed. That was strange. If the coworker could confirm Mercer's alibi, why had nobody followed up? The new detective searched for the man. The original name was incomplete. There was no current address, no recent phone number. The investigator searched employment record. Nothing. Then an old newspaper archive produced a possible lead. The coworker had moved out of Oregon years earlier, but he was alive. Investigators located him, and when they asked about November 1984, the man's reaction surprised them. He remembered Daniel Mercer, but he did not remember working with him that night. That single statement did not prove anything. Memory after 38 years was unreliable, but it created a problem. Mercer's original alibi could no longer be treated as solid. The detective went back to the file. The old statement was read again. Mercer had been confident. He had given specific details. He claimed he worked until nearly midnight. He claimed he went home directly afterward, but there was no independent documentation proving it. The investigator checked other records. A local business had closed decades earlier. Its employment files were gone. The building itself had been demolished. The past had erased the paper trail, but not everything had disappeared. A former supervisor was still alive. He remembered Mercer. He remembered the job. And he remembered something else. Mercer had left early that night. The supervisor could not remember exactly when, but he believed it was before 9. That was a problem. Laura had left her apartment shortly after 8. Mercer had claimed he was working elsewhere. Now a former supervisor remembered him leaving. The timeline tightened. Investigators needed to know where Mercer went. They searched for additional witnesses. One former employee remembered seeing Mercer near his vehicle. Another remembered that Mercer had been unusually quiet the next day. Neither observation was enough. But the detective now had a reason to look closer. The fiber evidence was still being tested. The witnesses were being re-examined. The old alibi was weakening. And another discovery emerged. In the original case, file was a photograph of Laura's vehicle. The photograph showed the passenger side floor. Near the edge of the carpet was a small dark mark. The image was grainy. The original investigator had circled the area. Item 84, 117, the fiber. The detective compared the photograph with old records concerning Mercer's work. He had performed upholstery and flooring repair. His work involved synthetic material. That did not prove anything. Thousands of people worked with similar material. The detective knew that. But now the fiber had context. It was not simply a mysterious fragment. It could potentially tell investigators whether it came from a material associated with someone connected to Laura. The laboratory completed its first examination. The result was not an identification, but it was useful. The fiber contained characteristics consistent with a specific type of industrial synthetic material. The material was unusual enough to narrow the possibility. Investigators searched old business records. They found a company that had supplied that material in Salem during the 1980s. Mercer had worked for a contractor that used it. Again, coincidence was possible. But the case was accumulating coincidences. The detectives were careful. They did not want to build a theory around circumstantial connection. They needed independent evidence, so they looked at the physical evidence again. The vehicle, the fiber, the fingerprints, the photographs, the original search. They asked whether anything else had been missed. Then they found another item, a small fragment recovered from Laura's clothing. It had been classified in 1984 as an unidentified synthetic material. It had never been compared with the fiber from the vehicle. Now investigators sent both items to the laboratory. The laboratory compared their chemical and physical characteristics. The results showed similarities. The two fragments were consistent with the same material type. That did not establish who had left the material, but it suggested that the evidence from the vehicle and the victim might have a common source. Investigators now had two related fragments, one from the car, one from Laura's clothing, the same type of material, and Mercer had a professional connection to that material. The case was becoming more complicated, but it was also becoming more focused. Then investigators found something unexpected in the original autopsy record. There had been microscopic debris collected from Laura's clothing. The material had been preserved. At the time, investigators had not been able to identify it. The evidence had been stored for decades. Now it was tested. The laboratory found a mixture of fiber. Some were consistent with Laura's own clothing. Others were not. One fragment was unusual. It was consistent with the same synthetic material found in the vehicle. The detectives stared at the report. The same unusual material appeared in two separate locations. Laura's clothing, Laura's car. That meant the material could have been transferred. Someone or something had moved between those locations. The question became whether Mercer had access to it. Investigators searched his employment history. He had worked with the material. They located former coworkers. One remembered Mercer frequently carrying rolls of the material in his vehicle. Another remembered that he had complained about the material sticking to clothing. That sounded insignificant. But in a homicide investigation, insignificance can change quickly. Investigators searched for records of Mercer's vehicles. The vehicle he owned in 1984 was gone, but photographs existed. An old insurance record showed the model. A former mechanic remembered working on it. The detective wanted to know whether that vehicle could have transported Laura. The answer was uncertain. The original vehicle had been sold. No forensic examination was possible. Again, the case encountered a wall. The detective could not prove that Laura had ever been inside Mercer's vehicle, but they could establish that Mercer had access to the same type of material found on Laura. The next question was more important. Did Mercer know Laura well enough to persuade her to leave with him? A former neighbor provided an answer. She remembered seeing Mercer speaking with Laura several times. She said Laura appeared comfortable around him. There had been no obvious conflict. That meant Laura could have willingly approached him. The investigators now had a possible scenario. Laura leaves home. She meets someone she knows. She enters a vehicle or travels with that person. Something happens. Her own vehicle is later abandoned. The killer leaves the area. But investigators still needed proof. The scenario was not enough. The laboratory result was still incomplete. The detectives were waiting for the most important question. Could the old evidence contain biological material? The fiber itself might not, but other evidence could. The original investigators had collected material from Laura's clothing. Some samples had been preserved. At the time, they had been examined only under the technology available in 1984. Modern testing offered another possibility. The detectives requested advanced DNA analysis. The laboratory accepted the evidence. The chain of custody was checked. The samples were transferred under controlled conditions. Then the waiting began again. Meanwhile, investigators revisited another part of the case. The phone calls. Laura had reportedly received repeated calls before her disappearance. The original reports described them as unwanted, but not threatening. The caller had never been identified. In 1984, tracing a call could be difficult. There were no smartphones, no digital caller identification, no instant location history. Some telephone records had been lost. Others were incomplete. But investigators found a handwritten note in the original file. Laura had written down a number that had never been fully investigated. The detective checked it. The number had been disconnected decades earlier, but an old directory linked it to a business. The business had been associated with one of Mercer's former employers. That was the first connection between Mercer and the unexplained call. It was not proof. It was another lead. The detective followed it. A former employee remembered Mercer using the business phone. He said Mercer sometimes called people from there, but he could not remember whom. Again, memory. Again, uncertainty. Yet the pattern continued. Laura had received unexplained call. Mercer had access to a phone associated with the number. Mercer knew Laura. Mercer had been interviewed in 1984. His alibi was now questionable. Material associated with his work had appeared in evidence connected to Laura, and the laboratory was testing preserved biological material. The detectives were no longer asking whether Mercer should be considered. They were asking what else could be proven. Then the laboratory called. The DNA testing had produced a partial profile. The result was not complete, but it was enough to indicate that biological material from an unknown male was present. That changed the case. The detectives now had a biological clue. The profile was compared against available databases. Nothing immediately matched. The search returned no known suspect, no name, no arrest, no answer. But the profile could be preserved, and that mattered, because investigators could now compare it against specific individuals. Mercer became the obvious candidate. But obtaining a reference sample had to be done lawfully. The detectives watched him. They documented his movements. They did not confront him. They waited. They knew that a careless mistake could damage the case. Then, unexpectedly, the opportunity came. Mercer discarded an item containing biological material. Investigators lawfully recovered it. The sample was sent to the laboratory. A comparison was performed. The result arrived several days later. The partial profile from Laura's evidence was consistent with Mercer's DNA. The probability was extraordinarily strong. For the first time, the investigators had something that did not depend on a witness remembering 38 years earlier. They had science. The detective read the report twice. Then a third time. The old case had changed in a single document. The man who had once been only a name in a 1984 report was now connected to biological evidence recovered from the original investigation. But investigators still had to prove when and how that material got there. That question would become central, because DNA could place Mercer in contact with Laura. It could not automatically prove murder. The prosecution would need the rest. The timeline, the abandoned vehicle, the fibers, the witness statements, the false or questionable alibi, the phone calls, the location, the forensic evidence. Every piece had to fit. And as detectives began putting everything together, they realized something that made the case even more disturbing. The evidence had never been completely absent. It had been there from the beginning. The fiber, the unidentified material, the old telephone number, the incomplete alibi, the forgotten witness, the biological sample. The clues were scattered across decades. No single detective had seen all of them at once. The original investigators had not been careless. They had been working with limited technology and incomplete information. The new detectives had something the original team could never have possessed: hindsight, modern science, digital records, and the ability to search decades of information in ways that had been impossible in 1984. The murder had not changed. The evidence had not changed. The interpretation had. Now investigators had to decide what to do next. They could not simply announce that the case was solved. They had to build it, piece by piece, fact by fact, evidence by evidence. Because after 38 years, the difference between a breakthrough and a conviction would depend on one thing: whether the evidence could tell a complete story. And the story was beginning to take shape. Laura had trusted someone. That person had become the last link between her life and her death. And for almost 4 decades, that link had remained hidden inside evidence nobody knew how to read. Now the detectives knew the name: Daniel Mercer. They had the DNA. They had the timeline. They had the old statements. And they had one final problem. They still had to prove what happened after Laura got into that car, because somewhere in those missing hours was the moment when a disappearance became a murder. And that moment was still waiting to be reconstructed. The name was Daniel Mercer. For 38 years, that name had existed inside the investigation without becoming the answer. Now it was different. Now the name was connected to a DNA profile. A profile recovered from evidence collected in 1984. Evidence that had survived in storage. Evidence that had been almost forgotten. Evidence that modern science had finally been able to interpret. But the detectives knew better than to celebrate. A DNA match could change an investigation. It could not, by itself, reconstruct a murder. It could not explain the missing hour. It could not tell a jury what happened between the moment Laura Bennett left her apartment and the moment her body was discovered. The detectives needed the story, not a theory, not a guess, a sequence of events supported by evidence. And that meant going back to the night Laura disappeared. They started with the last confirmed sighting. 8 o'clock. Laura leaving her apartment. The rain had already begun. The parking lot was dark. Her neighbor saw her unlock the driver's door. Laura placed a paper bag inside the car. She entered. The engine started. Then she drove away. The neighbor remembered nothing unusual. No argument. No shouting. No struggle. No second person. At the time, that seemed ordinary. Now it was one of the most important observations in the entire file. Laura had not been forced into her car. She had not appeared frightened. She had left voluntarily. That suggested one possibility. She knew where she was going. And perhaps she knew the person she intended to meet. Investigators returned to Laura's phone record. The records were incomplete, but the old notes contained references to several calls received during the previous week. The number that appeared most often was associated with a business where Mercer had worked. That connection had been overlooked in 1984. Now it seemed significant. The detectives searched the old business address. The building was gone. A modern structure stood in its place, but the city's archived records still contained information about the company. Mercer had worked there. He had access to the telephone. He had access to the vehicles. And he had known Laura. The connection was becoming difficult to dismiss. The detectives still needed to understand why Laura would agree to meet him. They found the answer in an old statement from one of Laura's friends. The friend remembered Laura mentioning Mercer, not romantically, not fearfully, just casually. Laura had apparently asked Mercer for help with a problem involving her car. That detail had been buried in the original interview. The detective circled it. If Laura expected Mercer to help with her car, then meeting him would have seemed completely normal. She had no reason to believe she was walking toward danger. That possibility fit the evidence. It also explained why there had been no struggle at her apartment. Laura left willingly. She drove to meet someone. Then something happened. The next confirmed location was her abandoned vehicle. Investigators examined the distance between the two locations. The drive could have been made in less than 20 minutes. That left a narrow window. The detectives reconstructed it again. 8 o'clock. Laura leaves. 8:10. Possible travel. 8:20. Potential meeting. After that, the timeline becomes uncertain. Then the abandoned vehicle. The detectives looked at Mercer's own movement. His original statement claimed he had been working late, but the former supervisor had remembered him leaving early. The co-worker he had named as an alibi witness had denied remembering him working that night. The old alibi was collapsing. But prosecutors would need more than a weak alibi. They needed evidence connecting Mercer to the crime itself. That was where the DNA became critical. The biological material recovered from Laura's clothing was consistent with Mercer. The laboratory could not determine the exact moment of transfer, but it established a connection. Investigators asked whether Mercer could have had innocent contact with Laura. The answer was yes. He had known her. He had spoken with her. He had worked around her apartment. There were innocent explanations. That meant the DNA alone could not solve the case. The detectives needed the surrounding evidence. They examined the fiber evidence. The unusual synthetic material found inside Laura's vehicle matched material associated with Mercer's work. A similar material had also been recovered from Laura's clothing. Again, there was an innocent possibility. Mercer worked with the material. He could have encountered Laura during ordinary circumstances, but investigators noticed something else. The material was not common household fabric. It was a specialized industrial product. Mercer had regularly handled it. Laura had no known reason to possess it. The detectives sent the material for additional comparison. The laboratory confirmed the fibers were highly consistent. That still was not enough for an arrest, but it strengthened the chain. Then investigators returned to the abandoned vehicle. The original photographs showed something that had not received much attention in 1984. The passenger seat was pushed farther back than Laura normally positioned it. That detail came from a friend who knew how Laura drove. She was short. She kept the seat close to the steering wheel. In the photographs, The passenger seat was positioned unusually far backward. That could mean nothing. Someone could have moved it. A mechanic could have adjusted it. Laura herself could have changed it. But investigators now asked a different question. Could someone else have been sitting there? The answer was possible. The detectives examined the passenger side door. The original evidence report mentioned a faint partial fingerprint. It had been too incomplete for identification in 1984. Modern technology allowed investigators to enhance the image. The print was still insufficient for a definitive identification, but its location was interesting. It was on the interior door handle. A person sitting in the passenger seat could have left it. The detectives compared the pattern with Mercer's known print. The result was inconclusive. The print was too degraded. That was frustrating. Another clue. Another partial answer. Another dead end. But the case was no longer dependent on one piece of evidence. The detectives were building a mosaic, and every piece mattered. They interviewed former neighbors again. One woman remembered seeing a dark pickup near Laura's apartment on the night she disappeared. She could not remember the license plate. She could not remember the exact model, but she remembered a distinctive feature, a damaged taillight. Investigators searched old photographs of Mercer's vehicles. One truck matched the description. The passenger side rear light had been damaged around the same period. Mercer had repaired it shortly afterward. That information came from an old repair invoice. The invoice was dated 3 days after Laura disappeared. The detectives stared at the date. 3 days. The truck had been damaged. The witness remembered a damaged taillight. Mercer had given no explanation for the damage. Again, none of it was proof. But the pattern was becoming stronger. The detective requested the old repair record. It contained one line of handwritten information. Customer reports damage occurred while parked. That was Mercer's explanation. But investigators now had another question. Where had the truck been parked? No location was recorded. The mechanic had not asked. Or if he had, the answer was not written down. Another missing detail. Another gap. The detectives began looking for someone who might remember. The repair shop had closed years earlier, but the mechanic was alive. He was contacted. He remembered Mercer. He remembered the truck. He remembered the damaged taillight. And he remembered something that was not in the invoice. Mercer had arrived late at night. He seemed nervous. He had asked whether the repair could be done quickly. The mechanic could not remember the exact date until investigators showed him the invoice. Then the memory returned. It had been shortly after the murder. That statement did not prove Mercer had killed Laura, but it gave investigators another piece. The truck, the damaged light, the witness, the repair, the timeline. Everything was beginning to point toward the same night. The detectives now examined whether the truck could have been involved in moving Laura. The original investigation had focused almost entirely on her own vehicle. They had never thoroughly examined Mercer's truck. There was nothing left to examine physically. It had been sold decades ago, but investigators could reconstruct its size and interior. They compared it with the known crime scene evidence. The theory was possible, but investigators needed more. They returned to the location where Laura's body had been found. The area had changed. The road was wider. Nearby properties had been developed, but old aerial photographs survived. Investigators compared the landscape from 1984 with the present. The location had been isolated. A vehicle could have entered without being noticed. A person could have approached the area without witnesses. That mattered. The killer had not needed a complicated plan. They had needed privacy. And in 1984, there had been plenty of it. The detectives walked the old route. They measured travel times. They checked whether Mercer could have reached the location within the relevant window. He could. The timeline allowed it. That was another piece. Still, one question remained. Why Laura? Investigators looked into her life during the weeks before the murder. They found a financial dispute. Not a large one, but significant enough to matter. Laura had discovered irregularities involving money connected to a contractor. The contractor was not Mercer, but Mercer had worked for the company. Laura had apparently asked questions. She had wanted documents. She had become uncomfortable. A coworker remembered Laura saying she did not trust someone connected to the business. She never gave a name. The detective wondered whether the statement had been recorded somewhere. It had, buried inside a personnel interview. The coworker had told police in 1984 that Laura had complained about someone at the contractor's office. The original detective had not followed the lead, perhaps because there were too many possibilities. Now investigators had a reason to revisit it. They interviewed the coworker again. The woman was older. Her memory was incomplete. But one thing remained. She remembered the name Mercer. She said Laura had mentioned him in connection with the dispute. That was significant. Mercer was not simply someone who happened to know Laura. He may have had a reason to fear what she knew. The detectives searched business records. The contractor had been involved in several questionable financial transactions during the period. Nothing had resulted in criminal charges, but investigators found that Laura had requested information. She had apparently been asking questions about payments. The motive began taking shape. It was not jealousy. It was not random violence. It may have been an attempt to silence someone. But detectives still needed to prove that theory. They examined Laura's personal papers. Some had been preserved by her family. Among them was a handwritten note. The note contained a name. The handwriting was Laura's. The name was Mercer. Under it were 2 words, "Ask why." That discovery stunned investigators. The note had never been included in the original police file. Laura's family had kept it among personal belongings. They had not understood its importance. The detective photographed it. The handwriting was examined. The note appeared authentic. But what did "ask why" mean? There was no date, no explanation, no additional sentence. It could have referred to something completely unrelated, but the timing was disturbing. The note had been found among papers Laura had used during the weeks before her death. The detectives now had a possible motive, a possible connection, a possible timeline, a DNA link, a fiber link, a questionable alibi, a damaged vehicle, and a witness who remembered Mercer near Laura's apartment. The case had transformed. For 38 years, the investigation had been a collection of unanswered questions. Now those questions were beginning to connect. But investigators knew the most dangerous stage was still ahead. They had to decide whether the evidence was strong enough to accuse a man of murder committed nearly 4 decades earlier. They could not afford to be wrong. A wrongful accusation would destroy the credibility of the entire investigation. So they tested everything: the DNA, the fiber, the timeline, the witness statements, the old records, the handwritten note, the vehicle evidence. Every fact was challenged. Every alternative explanation was considered. And then the detectives found the detail that finally changed their understanding of the case. The DNA was not simply on Laura's clothing. It was found in a location that investigators believed was directly connected to the fatal assault. That made an innocent explanation much harder. The laboratory performed additional testing. The result remained consistent. Mercer's DNA, Laura's evidence, the same case, the same night, the same 38-year-old mystery. Now the detectives had something they believed could withstand scrutiny. They prepared the investigative package. The prosecutor reviewed it. Questions were asked. More documents were requested. The detectives supplied them. The prosecutor asked about the old alibi. They supplied the new witness statement. Questions about the fibers. They supplied the laboratory comparison. Questions about the DNA. They supplied the complete forensic report. Questions about motive. They supplied the financial records. Piece by piece, the case became harder to dismiss. The warrant request was prepared. For the first time since 1984, the investigation had reached a moment nobody had expected to see again. An arrest was coming. But before the suspect could be taken into custody, investigators had one final task. They had to find him. Daniel Mercer had lived under the radar for decades. He had changed addresses. He had changed jobs. He had built a life that had nothing to do, publicly, with Laura Bennett. But the investigators found him. He was living outside Oregon. He had no idea that the evidence from 1984 had survived. He had no idea that modern testing had connected him to the case. And he had no idea that detectives had reconstructed the night. The warrant was approved. The arrest team began planning. There would be no warning, no press conference, no public announcement. The investigators wanted the operation quiet, because the man they believed had escaped justice for nearly 4 decades was about to hear the name he had not heard in an official accusation since 1984, Laura Bennett. The case was no longer cold. The evidence had finally spoken. And this time, investigators were listening. The arrest team arrived before sunrise. The sky was still dark. Daniel Mercer was inside the house. He had lived there for years. To his neighbors, he was simply an older man who kept to himself. There was nothing about the quiet house that suggested a homicide investigation. Nothing suggested that detectives had been rebuilding a murder case around him. Nothing suggested that a 38-year-old file had suddenly become active again. Then the knock came. Mercer opened the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. A lay detective showed his badge, then the warrant. Mercer's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The detective watched his eyes move across the document. Then he said the words Mercer had spent decades believing he would never hear. "You're under arrest for the murder of Laura Bennett." The house became silent. Mercer did not immediately respond. He looked at the detective, then at the warrant, then back at the detective. He asked one question. Why now? The answer was simple. DNA. The detective did not explain the entire case. He did not need to. Mercer was handcuffed. The door closed behind him. And 38 years after Laura Bennett disappeared, the man investigators believed was responsible was finally in custody. News spread through Salem within hours. The headline appeared everywhere. A forgotten murder. A decades-old disappearance. A DNA breakthrough. An arrest. For Laura's family, the news was almost impossible to absorb. They had heard versions of hope before. Every few years, another investigator would contact them. Another lead. Another possible suspect. Another review. Then nothing. This time was different. There was a name. There was an arrest. There was forensic evidence. There was a courtroom. But an arrest is not a conviction. The investigators knew that. The prosecutor knew it. And the defense would make sure everyone remembered it. Mercer's attorney immediately challenged the case. The defense argued that the DNA evidence could have an innocent explanation. Mercer had known Laura. He had worked near her apartment. He had interacted with her. Contact was possible. The defense questioned the age of the evidence. They questioned the preservation methods. They questioned the laboratory testing. They questioned witness memories. And they attacked the timeline. 38 years was a long time. People forget. Records disappear. Buildings are demolished. Vehicles are destroyed. Witnesses die. Memories change. The defense argued that investigators were trying to reconstruct a story from fragments. The prosecution responded with the evidence. Not emotion. Not headlines. Evidence. The biological material had been collected in 1984. It had remained sealed. The chain of custody was documented. The modern laboratory testing produced a profile consistent with Mercer. The evidence had not appeared yesterday. It had existed since the original investigation. That distinction mattered. The prosecution argued that modern science had not created evidence. It had revealed information already contained inside evidence collected decades earlier. The courtroom became the new crime scene. Every old document mattered. Every statement was examined. Every photograph was enlarged. Every timestamp was questioned. The prosecutor began with Laura. Not the suspect. Not the DNA. Laura. She was 27 years old. She had a job. Friends. Family. Plans. She had walked out of her apartment expecting to return. She never did. The prosecution showed photographs from 1984. Laura smiling. Laura with friends. Laura at work. The photographs were old. The faces were young. The room became quiet. Then the prosecutor showed the photograph of Laura's abandoned car. The contrast was brutal. One image showed a woman alive. The next showed the vehicle from which she disappeared. The case was no longer an abstract collection of evidence. It had a victim. Then came the timeline. 8 o'clock. Laura leaves. The possible meeting. The abandoned vehicle. The later discovery of her body. The prosecution placed each event on a board. The defense immediately challenged the uncertainty. There were no cameras. No electronic location record. No GPS. No modern digital trail. But the prosecutor did not pretend there was certainty where there was none. Instead, the case was presented as a series of independently supported facts that made the timeline more powerful. Laura left her apartment. Mercer had a connection to her. Mercer's original alibi was contradicted by a former coworker. A vehicle associated with Mercer had damage shortly after the murder. A witness remembered a similar vehicle near Laura's apartment. Specialized fibers associated with Mercer's work were recovered from evidence connected to Laura. and biological material recovered from the original investigation produced a DNA profile consistent with Mercer. The defense attacked each piece individually, but prosecutors kept bringing the pieces back together. One fiber could be coincidence. One witness could be mistaken. One damaged taillight could be unrelated. One questionable statement could be explained. One DNA result could theoretically have an innocent explanation. But the question was not whether each piece could be explained separately. The question was whether all of them could be explained together. That was harder. Much harder. The prosecution then introduced the old telephone evidence. Laura had received repeated calls before her death. The number had been connected to a business associated with Mercer. The defense argued that multiple employees had access to the phone. That was true. The prosecutor acknowledged it. But then another document appeared, a handwritten note from Laura. The name Mercer. 2 words. Ask why. The defense objected. The judge allowed the note to be considered only within its proper evidentiary context. The prosecutor did not claim the note was a confession or a direct accusation. It was simply evidence of Laura's concern, evidence that she had written Mercer's name before she died. The defense argued that the note could have referred to anything. That was also true. Nobody could prove what Laura meant, but the note added another layer to the investigation. Then came the witness from the repair shop. The mechanic took the stand. He was older now. His hair was white. His voice was slower. He remembered Mercer bringing in the truck. He remembered the damaged taillight. He remembered Mercer appearing nervous. The defense asked how he could remember something from 1984. The mechanic admitted he could not remember every detail, but he had the original repair invoice. The date was written on it. The vehicle description was recorded. His testimony was not based entirely on memory. It was anchored by a document created at the time. That distinction strengthened the prosecution's argument. The mechanic had not suddenly invented the memory after investigators contacted him. The paper had existed for decades. The repair had existed. The date had existed. Only the significance was new. Then came the DNA expert. The courtroom became silent. The expert explained the testing process, the original evidence, the preservation, the modern analysis, the profile, the comparison, the probability. The defense asked about contamination. The expert explained the safeguard. They asked about transfer. The expert acknowledged that transfer was scientifically possible. Then came the critical question. Could the DNA have reached the evidence through ordinary innocent contact? The expert could not completely exclude every theoretical possibility. Science rarely speaks in absolute terms, but the location and condition of the biological material made the prosecution's interpretation far more likely. The defense pushed harder. The expert remained calm. The DNA did not say, Daniel Mercer killed Laura Bennett. DNA does not speak that way. It says something narrower. A biological profile was present. That profile was consistent with Mercer. The rest of the case had to establish what that meant. That was exactly what the prosecution attempted to do. The next witness was one of the detectives who reopened the case. He described finding the old evidence inventory. He described the faded envelope. He described reading the phrase untested beyond original comparison. He described requesting the evidence. Then he described the moment the laboratory result arrived. The defense asked whether investigators had already suspected Mercer before the DNA test. The detective answered yes. That admission was important. The defense argued that investigators had become focused on Mercer and interpreted later evidence through that theory. Confirmation bias. The detective did not deny the possibility. Instead, he explained that the DNA evidence had been tested independently. The laboratory did not know the entire theory behind the case. The result existed before investigators knew what it would show. That made the forensic evidence harder to dismiss. Then prosecutors introduced the original 1984 detective's notes. The handwriting was unmistakably old. One page contained a sentence that had barely been noticed for decades. Mercer appears to know more than he is saying. The courtroom went silent again. The defense objected. The judge reviewed the document. The note was admitted only to establish the direction of the original investigation, not as proof of guilt. That distinction mattered. The original detective had suspected Mercer, but suspicion had not been enough. The prosecutor emphasized the point. In 1984, the evidence did not meet the threshold needed to make the case. There had been no DNA match, no confirmed connection. No reliable timeline. The investigation stalled. Mercer remained free. 38 years later, the evidence had changed. Not because investigators wanted it to, because science had advanced. The defense then presented its own theory. They suggested Laura could have encountered Mercer innocently. They suggested the DNA may have come from an earlier interaction. They questioned whether the fibers were truly unique. They challenged the witness who remembered the truck. They argued that the timeline remained incomplete. They reminded the jury that the prosecution carried the burden of proof. Every doubt mattered. The prosecutor knew the defense had found the weakest part of the case. There was no eyewitness to the murder, no recovered weapon, no recording, no confession, no complete minute-by-minute timeline. The case was circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence can be powerful. It depends on how tightly the pieces connect. The prosecutor returned to the evidence. Laura's car, the biological material, the fibers, the calls, the note, the alibi, the damaged truck, the witness, the location, the timing. Then came the most important evidence, a second DNA result. Investigators had requested additional testing on another preserved sample. The laboratory had identified another male profile. It matched Mercer. The new sample came from a different piece of evidence, different location, same suspect. That mattered enormously. One DNA connection could be challenged. Two independent biological connections were much harder to explain. The defense objected again. The laboratory expert explained the result. The profiles were consistent. The probability of an unrelated individual producing the same profile was extraordinarily small. The defense asked about secondary transfer. Again, theoretically possible. But investigators now had multiple independent pieces of evidence placing Mercer in contact with Laura during the relevant period. The case had reached a point where coincidence required too many explanations. The jury listened. Mercer remained expressionless. For the family, every word was painful. They had spent decades imagining what might have happened. Now the details were being spoken aloud in a courtroom. The night Laura disappeared. The abandoned car. The isolated location. The evidence. The biological material. The years of silence. Then the prosecution introduced one final piece of evidence. A map. Not a modern map. A map reconstructed from 1984 road record. It showed Mercer's workplace, Laura's apartment, the location of the abandoned vehicle, the location where Laura was found, the route between them. Investigators calculated the travel time. Mercer could have made the entire journey within the relevant window. The defense argued that other people could have done the same. The prosecutor agreed, then asked a different question. How many of those people were connected to Laura? How many had been in contact with her? How many had given investigators an alibi that later became questionable? How many were connected to the specialized material? How many were connected to the DNA? The answer narrowed the field. The case was not about proving that nobody else could possibly have committed the murder. It was about proving whether the evidence established Mercer's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial continued. Days became weeks. The media gathered outside. Old residents spoke about the case. Some remembered Laura. Others had forgotten. Some expressed shock that the investigation had survived so long. One retired detective said he had never expected to see an arrest. Another said the case had haunted investigators because the answer seemed close but unreachable. For the family, the attention was overwhelming. They had spent decades without camera. Now cameras were everywhere. Every courtroom entrance became a news image. Every hearing became a headline. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained controlled. The evidence had to stand on its own. And as the final arguments approached, one question dominated everything. Was this finally enough? 38 years after Laura Bennett vanished into the darkness of Salem, Oregon, the answer would soon belong to 12 people sitting inside a courtroom. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed. People went to work. Rain fell against the windows. Life continued. But inside that courtroom, time had stopped at 1984. Laura was still 27. Her car was still sitting beneath the darkness. The old evidence was still sealed in its envelope. And the man accused of killing her was waiting for the verdict. For decades, the case had been a question. Now it was about to become a judgment. The courtroom doors opened just after 9 in the morning. Outside, reporters were already waiting. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Microphones were held against the cold Oregon air. The story had become bigger than Salem. A woman murdered in 1984. A suspect identified nearly 4 decades later. Evidence preserved for generations. DNA technology bringing an old investigation back to life. But inside the courtroom, there was no television drama. There was only silence. Daniel Mercer sat beside his attorney. His hands were folded. His face was difficult to read. Across the room, Laura Bennett's family waited. They had spent 38 years waiting for this moment. 38 years of birthdays without her. 38 years of unanswered questions. 38 years of hearing the same phrase. The investigation remains open. Now the phrase was gone. The case was in court. And the evidence was finally being tested in public. The prosecution began its closing argument by returning to the beginning. Not to the DNA. Not to Mercer. To Laura. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Laura had left her apartment believing she would return. She had no reason to believe that night would be different from any other. She left behind the ordinary things people leave behind when they expect to come home. Her purse. Personal belongings. Plans. A future. Then she disappeared. Her vehicle was found abandoned. Her body was discovered days later. And the person responsible had remained unidentified for decades. The prosecutor paused. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere. The evidence never disappeared. The evidence had simply waited. The prosecutor displayed the original evidence envelope. Oh, faded. Marked with a number assigned in 1984. 117. Inside had been a tiny piece of synthetic material. At the time, investigators could not determine what it meant. They preserved it anyway. That decision became important 38 years later. Modern testing had identified characteristics consistent with material connected to Mercer's work. Then the biological evidence had been tested. A DNA profile. Mercer. Not a rumor. Not a memory. Not a theory. A forensic result. The defense had spent days explaining why the evidence might not mean what prosecutors believed it meant. Now the prosecutor answered those arguments one by one. Could DNA be transferred? Yes. Could people encounter each other innocently? Yes. Could a witness remember something incorrectly after 38 years? Yes. Could a fiber appear in a vehicle for an innocent reason? Yes. Could an old telephone record have another explanation? Yes. The prosecutor did not deny any of it. Instead, the argument became more direct. One coincidence could be explained. 2 could be explained. Perhaps 3. But when every independent piece pointed toward the same person, the jury had to consider the entire picture. The prosecutor placed the timeline on the screen. Laura leaves her apartment. Mercer is connected to her. Mercer claims he is working. A former supervisor remembers him leaving. A coworker cannot confirm the alibi. A witness remembers a vehicle near Laura's apartment. The same vehicle later shows unexplained damage. Laura had written Mercer's name before her death. Specialized fibers connected to Mercer's work appear in evidence. Biological material connects Mercer to Laura. Additional DNA testing produces another matching result. The map shows Mercer could reach every relevant location during the critical period. The prosecutor stepped away from the screen. This is not one piece of evidence, she said. This is a chain. The defense stood next. The attorney's strategy was clear. Break the chain. The first attack focused on the DNA. The defense attorney reminded the jury that DNA could establish contact, but not intent. Mercer knew Laura. That was never disputed. He had worked near her apartment. He had spoken with her. They had known each other. Therefore, the presence of his DNA did not automatically prove murder. The defense then attacked the fibers. The material was associated with Mercer's occupation, but other workers had handled it. Other vehicles had carried it. The defense argued that the fibers could have been transferred during ordinary contact. Then came the witnesses. The defense questioned the woman who remembered the truck. She had been young in 1984. She had seen the vehicle briefly. She admitted she could not remember the license plate. She could not swear to the exact model. She remembered only the general shape and damaged taillight. The defense attorney asked whether she had seen photographs of Mercer's truck before giving her statement. She admitted investigators had shown her old photographs. That became a major point for the defense. Memory could be influenced. Memory could change. Memory could become contaminated by information learned later. The defense attorney looked toward the jury. 38 years is a long time. Nobody in the room could disagree. Then the defense attacked the mechanic. He remembered Mercer bringing the truck for repair, but the mechanic could not independently remember the exact night. The date came from the invoice. The defense argued that the invoice proved a repair. It did not prove why the repair was needed. It did not prove where the truck had been. It did not prove Laura had ever been inside it. Again, the defense was correct. The prosecution had no direct evidence connecting the truck to the murder, only circumstances. Then the defense turned toward the handwritten note. Laura's note. The name, Mercer. 2 words. Ask why. The defense argued that the note was meaningless without context. Laura had written the name, but she had not written "he threatened me." She had not written "I am afraid." She had not written "Daniel did this." There was no direct accusation. The note could have referred to business, money, work, a personal disagreement, anything. The defense attorney held up the photograph of the note. Words without context are not proof of murder. The prosecutor did not object, because the argument was fair. The case had weaknesses. Everyone knew it. There was no eyewitness to the killing, no confession, no murder weapon, no video, no complete timeline. The prosecution was asking the jury to connect circumstances. The defense was asking them to doubt those connections. That was the entire battle. Not whether Mercer had known Laura. He had. Not whether his DNA was present. It was. Not whether his truck had been damaged. It had. Not whether his original alibi was questionable. It was. The question was whether those facts formed a sufficiently reliable picture of what happened. Then the prosecution made one final move. The medical examiner was recalled. The doctor had reviewed the original autopsy and modern forensic finding. The prosecutor asked about the biological material. The doctor explained where it had been recovered. The location was significant. The defense had described innocent transfer, but the location was not random. The biological material had been recovered from an area associated with the assault. The doctor explained that the evidence was consistent with direct contact, not absolute proof of the sequence, but strong evidence of contact under circumstances that required explanation. The defense objected to the interpretation. The judge allowed the testimony. The doctor continued. There was no evidence suggesting that the material had been deposited there through an unrelated event. The prosecution asked one final question. Is the evidence consistent with the conclusion that Mr. Mercer had physical contact with Miss Bennett during the events surrounding her death? The doctor answered carefully. Yes. The courtroom became silent. That single answer changed the weight of the DNA evidence. It was no longer merely a biological connection. It was evidence connected to the circumstances of the fatal encounter. The defense attorney stood again. He asked whether the doctor could determine the exact time of transfer. No. Could the doctor determine whether the contact was intentional? No. Could the doctor state that the DNA itself proved murder? No. The defense sat down. The limitations remained. But so did the evidence. The jury received the instruction. They were told that the burden belonged entirely to the prosecution. They were told that suspicion was not enough. They were told that they must reach a verdict based on evidence. Then they left. The courtroom doors closed. Laura's family remained seated. Mercer remained seated. The lawyers waited. Outside, reporters watched the hallway. Nobody knew how long deliberations would take. An hour. 6 hours. A day. Several days. The jury entered the deliberation room with a case nearly 4 decades old. Inside the room were photographs from 1984, evidence reports, DNA results, maps, witness testimony, the handwritten note, the old alibi, the new forensic analysis. The jurors began with the evidence. One juror reportedly focused immediately on the DNA. Another focused on the timeline. Another questioned the reliability of the old witnesses. The debate continued. There was no unanimous certainty at first. That was expected. A case this old was complicated. The jurors went through the evidence again. They requested clarification on the DNA testimony. They reviewed the timeline. They examined the photographs. The judge answered their questions. Then the jurors returned to deliberation. The defense waited. The prosecution waited. Laura's family waited. For the first time, the family was not waiting for an investigator to call. They were waiting for 12 strangers to decide whether the evidence was enough. Hours passed. The courthouse became quieter. The media coverage intensified. Every update became a headline. Breaking. Jury deliberates in 1984 Salem murder case. Then another. DNA evidence at center of decades-old homicide trial. The story had become national. People who had never heard Laura's name were now reading about her. But for her family, the headlines meant little. They knew her. They remembered her voice. They remembered her laugh. They remembered what was lost. The case was never really about the headline. It was about the empty space Laura left behind. The jury returned the following afternoon. The courtroom filled quickly. Mercer entered. The judge took the bench. Everyone stood, then sat. The clerk received the verdict form. The foreperson stood. The judge asked whether the jury had reached a unanimous decision. Yes. The room seemed to stop breathing. The first verdict was read. Guilty. There was no reaction from Mercer. The second charge was read. Guilty. The courtroom remained silent. Laura's mother lowered her head. Her brother closed his eyes. A relative reached across and held his hand. Nobody celebrated. There was relief. But it was mixed with grief. Because a guilty verdict could not return Laura. It could not erase 38 years. It could not give her the life she should have lived. It could only establish accountability. For the first time, the official record would contain an answer. Daniel Mercer was responsible for Laura Bennett's death. The judge ordered Mercer held pending sentence. The defense announced plans to appeal. The prosecution declined to call the case easy. It had never been easy. The case had survived because evidence had survived. The tiny fiber, the preserved biological material, the old records, the forgotten witness, the repair invoice, the telephone notes, the handwritten page. The pieces had existed independently for decades. No one piece had been enough. Together, they became a story. After the verdict, Laura's family left the courthouse. Reporters approached. Microphones appeared. Questions followed. How did they feel? What did the verdict mean? Did they finally have closure? Laura's brother stopped. He looked toward the courthouse. Then he answered quietly. Closure is a complicated word. He said the verdict mattered. He said accountability mattered. But he said 38 years could not be returned. That sentence stayed with everyone who heard it, because that was the real cost of the cold case. The killer had been identified. The courtroom had spoken. The evidence had done what investigators hoped it would do. A time had already taken everything it could take. Laura should have been 55 when the case was solved. Instead, she remained 27 forever. Her friends had aged. Her family had aged. The city had changed. The roads had changed. The buildings had changed. Technology had changed. But the murder remained exactly where it had always been. November 1984. A rainy night. A woman leaving her apartment. A car disappearing into darkness. A family waiting. And a small piece of evidence sitting quietly inside an envelope. For decades, that envelope meant almost nothing. Then science caught up with it. That is what made the case so haunting. The breakthrough did not come from a spectacular discovery at a fresh crime scene. It came from something investigators had already collected, something they had already cataloged, something they had already stored. The clue had been there. The entire time. It simply had not been readable. That realization changed the way Salem looked at old cases. Police departments began reviewing evidence from other unsolved murders. Families began asking whether forgotten evidence could be tested again. Cold cases that had seemed impossible suddenly looked different. Not solved, not guaranteed, but possible. Because technology does not erase the past. Sometimes it simply gives the past a voice. Laura's case became an example of that. A murder that survived 3 decades. A file that gathered dust. A name that disappeared from headlines. A suspect who believed time was protection. And evidence that refused to disappear. The final evidence log was updated. The old case number remained. The original date remained. The victim's name remained. But one word changed. Open. It was no longer written beside the case. The investigation had ended. The evidence had finally answered the question that had haunted Salem since 1984. Who killed Laura Bennett? The answer was Daniel Mercer. But another question remained. How many other cases were still waiting for their forgotten evidence to speak? How many envelopes were sitting in old evidence rooms? How many fibers? How many photographs? How many biological samples? How many fingerprints to damage for the technology of yesterday but readable by the technology of tomorrow? Nobody knew. That was the unsettling part. The past was still full of evidence. Somewhere, inside another forgotten box, another piece of a story could still be waiting. And somewhere, perhaps, another family was still waiting for a phone call, waiting for a name, waiting for someone to open an old file and look again. Because sometimes a cold case does not die. It waits. It waits through rain, through retirement, through new buildings, through new detectives, through generations. And sometimes, after decades of silence, a laboratory machine examines something that everyone else had forgotten. A tiny fiber, a microscopic stain, a damaged print, a fragment of DNA. And suddenly, the past moves. A name appears. A door opens. A suspect is found. And a mystery that once seemed destined to remain unsolved begins speaking again. For Laura Bennett, that moment came 38 years too late. But it came. And in Salem, Oregon, the old case finally stopped being a question. It became a record, a verdict, a name, a truth recovered from evidence that had been waiting in the dark. The verdict should have been the end. For most people, it was. The headlines moved on. The cameras disappeared from the courthouse steps. Reporters found newer stories. The courtroom emptied. Daniel Mercer was taken into custody. The legal process continued. But for the investigators who had reopened Laura Bennett's case, something still bothered them. The verdict had answered who. It had answered responsibility. But it had not answered every question. There were still missing hours. There were still unexplained movements. There were still details from 1984 that had never been fully reconstructed. And now that Mercer had been convicted, investigators had access to something they had never possessed before. His full history, his old statements, his movements, his relationships, his financial records, his employment records. Everything could be examined again. Not because the conviction was in doubt, because the detectives wanted to understand how the case had remained unsolved for so long. The first question was simple. Why had Mercer not been caught in 1984? The answer was buried inside the original investigation. The first detectives had suspected him. They had questioned him. They had documented inconsistency. But the evidence had not been enough. Mercer had denied meeting Laura. He had denied being near her vehicle. He had denied knowing anything about her disappearance. His answers were confident, specific, detailed. And that detail had worked in his favor. Investigators believed his story was suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Without biological evidence connecting him to the crime, there was no way to bridge the gap. That was the weakness. The case had a suspect. It did not have a case against the suspect. The distinction mattered. Mercer walked out of the police station in 1984. Laura remained dead. The file remained open. And the years began passing. The reopened investigation revealed something else. Mercer had changed his life shortly after Laura's death. He left Salem. He changed employers. He eventually moved out of Oregon. None of those actions were criminal. People move. People change jobs. People start over. But investigators now looked at the timing. Mercer left Salem within months of the murder. He did not disappear immediately. He remained in the area for a while. That made the departure less dramatic than it might have seemed. But the detectives noticed something. He had sold his truck, the same truck associated with the damaged taillight. The vehicle disappeared from his records. Investigators traced it. The truck had been sold to another man. That man was located. He was elderly. He remembered purchasing the vehicle. He did not know its history. He had used it for several years. Then he sold it again. The vehicle was eventually scrapped. Nothing remained. But the paper trail confirmed one thing. Mercer had gotten rid of the truck shortly after the murder. The defense had previously argued that the truck damage was meaningless. Now investigators understood why it had mattered. It was not proof by itself, but it was another unexplained event surrounding the same period. The detectives then revisited the phone calls. Laura had received several calls connected to a business Mercer had access to. The original investigators had never established who made those calls. Modern records could not recreate the conversation. But an old employee remembered Mercer using the phone repeatedly during the weeks before Laura's death. The employee had assumed Mercer was calling suppliers. He had no reason to think otherwise. But when investigators showed him Laura's name, his memory shifted. He remembered Mercer asking whether someone was at home. The employee could not remember exactly when, but he remembered the question. That mattered. It suggested Mercer may have been monitoring Laura's movements. Again, investigators had to be careful. A memory after 38 years was not perfect, but the new information fit the existing timeline. Mercer knew when Laura was home. He knew when she left. He knew where she lived. He had access to a phone connected to her, and he had been around her before the murder. The investigators then examined Laura's financial concern. This became one of the most disturbing discoveries. The contractor Mercer worked for had been involved in questionable billing. Laura's job gave her access to administrative information. She had noticed inconsistencies. She had asked questions. She had apparently kept notes. Investigators found copies of documents in her personal file. The documents showed unexplained payments. Some were connected to projects Mercer had worked on. The amounts were not enormous, but the pattern was unusual. Laura had begun tracking them. And then, shortly before her death, she had written Mercer's name. Ask why. That note suddenly looked different. Investigators could not prove Laura had planned to expose him, but the possibility was strong. Mercer may have believed Laura knew something that could threaten his job, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. The motive was no longer simply a theory about personal conflict. There was a possible financial reason, and that changed the investigation again. Detectives began reviewing the contractor's records. Several employees had left around the same period. One had been fired. Another had moved away. Another had died. The company itself no longer existed, but the archived financial records remained. They revealed discrepancies, payments that did not match invoices that had been altered, dates that did not align, names that appeared repeatedly. Mercer was not the only person involved. That became important. The murder might have been connected to more than one person. The detectives searched for anyone else who could have benefited from Laura's silence. Several names emerged, but none had the same connection to the physical evidence. None had the DNA. None had the questionable alibi. None had been placed near Laura's apartment that night. Mercer remained at the center. The detectives then returned to the crime scene, not the modern landscape, the 1984 landscape. They used archived aerial photographs, old property maps, road records, utility plans. They reconstructed the area as it had looked that night. The location where Laura was found had been darker and more isolated than it appeared today. There had been fewer homes, less traffic, fewer lights. A person could have driven there without attracting attention. That mattered. The killer did not need extraordinary planning. The geography itself provided protection. The detectives calculated travel times from Mercer's workplace, from Laura's apartment, from the abandoned vehicle, from the location where the body was found. The distances aligned. Mercer could have made the journey. That did not prove he did, but the timeline remained possible. Then investigators discovered something else. A former resident remembered hearing a vehicle late that night. The witness had been interviewed in 1984, but had never been asked about the sound. The person remembered a truck engine, a vehicle stopping briefly, then leaving. The witness could not identify the truck, but the timing matched the estimated window. The detective added the statement to the case reconstruction. The pattern was becoming remarkably consistent. A truck near Laura's apartment. A truck with a damaged taillight. Mercer connected to that truck. Mercer leaving work earlier than claimed. Mercer connected to Laura. Mercer's DNA on evidence from the fatal encounter. And a vehicle route consistent with the crime. The detectives could now explain much of the night. But one thing still bothered them. Laura's car. Why had Mercer left it where it was found? If he had killed Laura, why not hide the vehicle? Why abandon it in a location where police would eventually find it? The answer came from the physical evidence. The car had been left far enough from Laura's home to make the situation appear like a disappearance, but close enough to a traveled road that it would eventually be discovered. It created confusion. A missing person scenario. Perhaps an accident. Perhaps a voluntary departure. Perhaps a kidnapping. The vehicle had been part of the deception. That possibility became stronger when investigators realized something else. Laura's purse had been left inside. Her identification was there. Her keys were there. But one item was missing. A small notebook. Her family remembered it. Laura carried it almost everywhere. It contained work notes, phone numbers, appointments, personal reminders. It had never been recovered. The notebook was not inside her apartment. It was not in the car. It was not among her belongings. It was simply gone. Investigators believed it might have contained information about the financial irregularities. If Mercer had taken it, that could explain why, but there was no way to prove what had happened to the notebook. It remained missing. Then came another discovery. A former coworker remembered Laura saying she planned to meet someone that evening. She had not identified the person, but the coworker remembered Laura saying she needed to clear something up. The phrase had been ignored in 1984. Now it was important. The coworker was shown a list of names. When Mercer appeared, she recognized it immediately. She said Laura had mentioned him. The investigators asked why. The coworker remembered Laura saying Mercer had become difficult to deal with. She believed he was hiding something. Again, the statement did not prove murder, but it established that Laura's concerns about Mercer existed before the night she died. The detectives began to see a sequence. Laura discovers financial irregularities. She starts asking questions. She becomes concerned about Mercer. She communicates with him. She plans to meet someone. She leaves her apartment. She disappears. Mercer provides an alibi. The alibi weakens. Physical evidence links him to Laura. Then he leaves Salem. 38 years later, DNA confirms the connection. The pieces were no longer scattered. They formed a pattern. But there was one problem. The case was already solved. Mercer had been convicted. Why keep investigating? Because the investigators believed the truth deserved more than a verdict. They wanted to know whether someone else had been involved. They wanted to know what happened to the missing notebook. They wanted to know whether Mercer had acted alone, and they wanted to understand whether the financial scheme had played a direct role in the murder. They reopened interviews. Former employees were contacted. Old records were searched. The contractor's financial history was examined. One former employee provided a disturbing statement. He said Mercer had once warned him to stay away from Laura. The warning had happened weeks before the murder. The employee had thought it was a personal dispute. He had ignored it. Now he understood it differently. Mercer may have been trying to prevent Laura from asking questions. Another employee remembered a confrontation. Laura had allegedly challenged Mercer about missing documents. Mercer became angry. He told her she did not understand what she was looking at. The original investigation had never found this information. The reason was simple. The employees had been interviewed briefly. Nobody knew which questions would matter decades later. The detective who reopened the case realized how much had been lost in those early interviews, not because investigators had failed, because investigations are built on what people know at the time. In 1984, nobody knew which details would become important. In 2022, investigators could see the entire picture. That is the strange power of cold cases. Time can destroy evidence. But time can also reveal patterns. Records that once seemed unrelated become connected. A name appearing in one document becomes meaningful when it appears in another. A forgotten witness becomes important when modern forensic evidence points in the same direction. A fiber becomes valuable when science can finally identify its characteristic. And a decades-old DNA sample can suddenly turn a suspect into a defendant. The investigators continued digging. Then they found a document that changed the motive. It was a financial statement. Mercer had received an unexplained payment shortly before Laura's death. The amount was small, but it came from an account associated with the contractor. The payment was not documented properly. Mercer had never mentioned it. Investigators compared it with the financial irregularities Laura had been examining. The connection was not conclusive, but it was troubling. A second payment appeared, then another. The amounts were different. The dates were different, but the same names kept appearing. Mercer, the contractor, the questionable invoices, Laura's notes. Suddenly, the murder appeared to have a possible financial background. The detectives believed Laura may have discovered something she intended to confront Mercer about. And that could explain why she left home willingly. She may have believed she was meeting someone to discuss a problem. She may have expected an argument. She may have expected an explanation. She did not expect death. That possibility made the case more disturbing. The killer may not have needed to lure Laura into danger. He may simply have convinced her that he wanted to talk. That was enough. A familiar face, a familiar vehicle, a familiar voice, a simple conversation. Then everything changed. The investigators now believed Laura's trust had been the weapon, not a gun, not a knife, Not force at the beginning. Trust. The same trust that allowed her to enter a vehicle without fear. The same trust that allowed her to meet someone at night. The same trust that gave the killer access to her. And that realization brought the case back to its most haunting detail. Laura's final confirmed sighting. She was not running. She was not screaming. She was not fighting. She was simply leaving. She believed she would return. She did not know that she was walking into the final hour of her life. For decades, that moment had been frozen inside the investigation. Now detectives understood what might have happened next, but they still had one final mystery. The missing notebook. If Laura had written down what she knew, where had it gone? And if Mercer had taken it, what had he done with it? Investigators searched every surviving record connected to Mercer. Storage units, property records, old addresses, employment files. They searched for anything that could have survived. Most searches produced nothing. Then an investigator found a reference to an old storage facility. Mercer had rented a unit shortly after leaving Salem. The rental records were incomplete, but the facility still existed. The unit was long gone. Its contents had been sold decades earlier, yet the manager's ledger survived. Mercer's name was there. The rental began weeks after Laura's murder. The unit remained active for several months. Then it was emptied. Nobody knew what had been inside. Nobody knew who had emptied it. The missing notebook could have been there, or it could have been something completely unrelated. There was no way to know. But the investigators had learned something from Laura's case. A clue did not have to be dramatic to matter. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a date, sometimes a forgotten invoice, sometimes a box that nobody had opened for 38 years. The case had already produced a conviction, but the search for the complete truth continued. And as investigators went deeper into Mercer's past, they discovered that Laura may not have been the only person who had become suspicious of him. Another woman had raised questions about the same financial records. She had left the company shortly afterward. She had moved away. And when investigators finally located her, she remembered something that made the detectives stop. She had been afraid of Daniel Mercer, not because he had threatened her directly, because of something he had said. A sentence, a warning, a statement she had never forgotten. And suddenly, the murder of Laura Bennett looked less like an isolated act. It looked like the final consequence of a secret that had been growing for months. A secret involving money. A secret involving documents. A secret Laura had begun uncovering. And a man who had every reason to want those questions to stop. The old cold case had been solved. But the deeper investigators went, the more they realized the murder itself might have been only the visible surface of a much larger story. And beneath that story was another mystery. How much had Laura discovered before she died? And how much had Daniel Mercer spent 38 years trying to bury?